I was actually going to direct this to Dmitry, which is we know, based on what we've seen over these many weeks, that Alan Jackson and Pat Dixon are going to be very prepared for a cross-examination of this witness. What should we be looking for when they begin, remembering that the defense hasn't quite finished their questioning, but we have to believe they're getting sort of close to the end, and at some point that cross-examination is definitely going to happen?
Well, I think one of the things they're going to explore is the bias of this doctor. And while I know that we've talked about the fact that he's testified before for the defense and the prosecution, here he's been hired by the defense, and I'm sure he's been paid substantial funds to testify and examine the evidence in this case and consult and cooperate with the defense. So clearly his bias is going to be examined. Now, one of the things he says is this is objective scientific evidence, but really he's a witness. His opinions are subjective. So he's putting a subjective spin on what he calls objective evidence. And that subjective spin, the prosecutors are going to argue and are going to examine the cross-examination, is affected by the bias that he has, that he is here on the witness stand to help the defense. And his opinions are, in fact, colored by that bias. So this objective evidence is really just his subjective opinion.
And do you think the credibility of his overall testimony then is going to lie in, as Peter talked a bit about, how he handles those challenges to what he calls as obvious conclusions?
Yes, the way he handles the cross-examination is something the jury's going to look to decide on his credibility. And remember, they're going to be comparing his credibility to the credibility of Dr. Pena, who is just a deputy medical examiner who actually I've personally used in a trial before. Very gregarious, credible witness, and they're going to be comparing that Dr. Pena's testimony and credibility to Dr. DeMaio. And ultimately, a lot of the opinions of Dr. DeMaio, I would think in cross-examination, are going to be examined by the prosecutors, and they can pose questions that, in fact, isn't this kind of injury consistent with a shooting by the hands of Phil Spector? That, in other words, Dr. DeMaio's opinions are also consistent with what the prosecution wants to prove. So I think that type of challenge is also going to be present during the cross-examination.